Hello, good afternoon. My name is Jocelyn Cesari. I am a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs. And this is a new session in our series on religion and nationalism, where we explored in the recent past the case of India, Russia, Turkey, and today it's our great pleasure and honor to discuss the condition of religion in China. Our main or special guest is Professor Mayfair Yang, who is a professor of religious studies and East Asian languages and cultural studies at the University of California. She authors the book Chinese Religiosities, Afflictions of Modernity and State Formation in 2008. And she has just published a new book this year called Reenchanting Modernity, Ritual, Economy and Society in Wenzhou, China. So thank you, Mayfair, for joining us. As a way of introduction, I would like to remind a few elements of the condition of religion in China today. According to the Pew data, the Chinese government is the most restrictive toward religious groups among all the 198 countries, including in the survey. It scored at 8.8 out of 10 on the government restrictions index. And this has been going on even more so. As you know, we are now facing a huge crisis with the persecution of the Uyghur in the province of Zhejiang, and it has even been qualified as a genocide by the United Nations. So the idea usually is that the communist ideology is the main trigger for this kind of repression. But if we look more closely, we see that the Chinese state has always had a differentiated policy toward religion, and that there is a trigger, usually, that is when the group starts to behave or act out of the guidance or parameters set up by the state. And just as a reminder, you have probably all heard about the Falun Gong group and the discrimination that was built by the state against this particular group, because at some point they were too important in numbers and too vocal in their criticism of the moral role of the state. And that's why they were banned in 1996. So, but until then, they were part of a system where they could have existed. So what we see usually emerging is a pattern that you can exist as a religion as long as you operate within the parameters, the legal institutional parameters set by the state, and that you are not using your religious tool to criticize the state. So the question that is also coming along is how much of this posture of the state vis-à-vis religion is related to the modern national context, how much of it is also a continuity from the previous empire situation where the emperor was also a sort of transcendent institution above all religion. And third, how much of the communist ideology has also been an element in the policies of the Chinese modern state toward religion. So this is my short introductions. And I would like to give the floor to Mayfair Yang, and we may have a little discussion after your presentation and then open to the floor or audience for Q&A. Mayfair, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Jocelyn. And I'm really happy to meet with everybody online under the circumstances of a webinar. So let me share screen with people because I've prepared a little PowerPoint. Let's see. So my discussion will start looking at the sort of longue durée of modernity and religion and secularization. So placing China in the context of larger modern global processes. And I firmly agree with Talal Asad, the anthropologist of religion, who was one of the earliest to declare that we really need to look at secularization processes as plural and diverse around the globe. And Charles Taylor also later wrote a book that has been quite influential. It's called A Secular Age, and he was restricting himself to looking at his familiar area of North Atlantic, Western Europe, and North America. And so in his account, he flags the Protestant Reformation as an important step towards the secular age, humanism in the West, and capitalism, and what he called the buffered self, the production of an individual self that is where the boundaries of the self are very clear. Of course, moving into consumerism where individual choice is everything, the buffered self is not, the boundaries are not porous to spirit possession or to communion with God and deities. So then this was followed just a couple of years ago by Mirjam Kunkler and Shirashri Shankar, who co-edited a book called A Secular Age Beyond the West. And this is a dialogue with Charles Taylor's book with contributors who were writing about places like Indonesia, Turkey, India, Japan, Egypt, China, and Russia. And they all showed that there was a pattern that was not there in Charles Taylor's account of the West. And that is the anti-colonial independence struggles, and which was instrumental in giving rise to nationalism in these societies, and where the modern state was central to the secularization process. And certainly China is very much there in having the anti-colonial independence struggles, nationalism of a very strong kind, and the modern state as being central. And China also is one of those societies that has a very long, continuous, archaic state. China was unified as an empire in 21 BCE. And even before that, you have the pristine state during Bronze Age in China developing, about 2000 BCE. And in many, now moving back to the modern period, in many modern nation states, secularization is only partial. So in many modern state experiences, you have this phenomenon of a new kind of religious nationalism that develops. Perhaps one of the oldest ones is Meiji Japan, all the way to the end of World War II when Japan was defeated. So that's religious nationalism. Now you have developing in India Hindu nationalism. And you could say that Israel is another place that religious nationalism is developing. But modern China stands out as an ultra-secularist place, highly resistant to religious nationalism. And so modern China is more like in the lineage of the French Revolution and the Soviet revolutions. And these two revolutions very much inspired the elite reformers in the 20th century in China. To just give you a quick overview of pre-modern Chinese religious traditions. So before modernity, China had quite a diversity of religious traditions. Of differing strengths, of course. So the more hegemonic, the more powerful religious tradition is the Confucian ritualized state, family, ancestor worship complex. Okay, this Confucian tradition, one could say, using Max Weber's terminology, was thoroughly this worldly. It did not spend too much time and attention on the other world, the afterlife, or other realms of transcendent existence of spirits and deities and supernatural forces. It also was adamantly opposed to religious millenarian excess. So it counseled throughout the ages, it really was very allergic to those millenarian peasant rebellions. Of course, Confucianism was wrapped up and embedded and thoroughly penetrated the state. It was state orthodoxy. So of course, as the state, it was very paranoid about millenarian peasant religions that really often got out of hand and mounted peasant rebellions. There was also a tendency of the Confucian religious tradition to be anti-clerical, i.e. It didn't like the clerics of Buddhism or Taoism. At times, it depended, historically, it waxed and waned in its anti-clericalism. And it also had the monopoly of worship of heaven. Heaven was the highest deity. Heaven was not anthropomorphized like the Christian God. There was no image of heaven. You had a tablet of heaven in the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. That is where the emperor would travel to offer sacrifices. And he alone had the monopoly of offering sacrifice to heaven. Then you have the Chinese Buddhist tradition. Buddhism entered China in about the 2nd century Common Era. And so Buddhism, unlike Confucianism, had this otherworldliness about it, and the notion of transmigration, where after death, humans can be reborn into animals or gods or other hungry ghosts. This meant that Buddhism's attention was often on the afterlife. It also had a monastic tradition of detachment and meditation. And it was also not bound by the empire. It was very universal and trans-empire, trans-regional in its proselytizing. And Buddhism spread from China to Japan and Korea. You have Taoism, which is about spontaneity, local self-government. It had community rituals of local communities, exorcistic and shamanistic cultures. And you have popular religion, which blended in with Taoism, and spirit possession in popular religion. Then you have Islam and Christianity, where the Hui are the Han assimilated Islam. And then the Uyghurs, where there are so much problems and right now human rights problems, the Uyghurs are Muslim today, and in Xinjiang, Xinjiang, this area where the Uyghurs live, were the only very late to be incorporated into the Chinese Empire in the Qing dynasty, only in the 19th century, okay? And Christianity is mainly from Western proselytizing in the 19th century. So here's, I'm getting to the heart of what I wanted to share with people, and 5 points about how the Chinese path of secularization differs from that of the West. One is that you have a long pre-modern tradition of Confucian agnosticism. Of course, secularization is something that comes with modernity. So for pre-modern China, the Confucians were not secular. They did believe in gods and deities and ghosts. They had ancestor worship. But Confucius in the Analects advised people to, honor them, gods and ghosts, but keep your distance. Okay, and should not get too otherworldly, not get too excessively religious. A second, so you already had a kind of precursor of secularization in the pre-modern period. Second, Chinese secularism was propelled by the crisis of Western and Japanese colonialism. So it produced a reactive Chinese nationalism and a massive buildup of the modern state. And these processes saw religious life as obstacles to the loyalty that it needed to drum up for the new unified nation state. Okay? Before modern times, Chinese people were very local oriented. They just cared about their local communities, the lineages, which were localized. And so they knew the emperor was up there, but he was far away. So it took modern nationalism to instill in every single individual the highest loyalty to the nation. Third difference is the centrality of Western 19th century unilinear social evolutionism. Okay, so Chinese modernizers and revolutionaries embraced this social evolutionism coming from the West. And because China went for Marxism, you have the legacy of Henry Louis Morgan, who was a very influential on Marx and Engels, and his stages of development, universal development of humanity, of progress, of the state of savagery to the state of barbarism to the stage of civilization. This line of thinking that saw history as linear, of course, also moving towards technological advance and materialism, material development and scientific progress was an incredible mobilizer for modern Chinese history. And of course, from this kind of technological materialist point of view, you also have this way of thinking of religion as backward and as keeping China behind the West. And so in many ways, you can see that China became westernized in this way of linear thinking with a vengeance. It just trashed its religious traditions. And the outcome of that huge, long process throughout the 20th century is that China today has moved so quickly materially, right? One can say, why is the US government so intent on Huawei? China's 5G has been developing really fast, okay? It's really an economic rival now. But of course, within China, the consequences of this incredible technological speed are also there's a lot of price to be paid, because in terms of basic ethics, China has really suffered, okay, with the attacks on religion, okay? So there's a kind of a spiritual emptiness in the midst of consumerist and materialist excess in China today. So that's a tragedy, I think, speaking personally, okay? It's a tragedy that Chinese people need to work on. A fourth difference from the West is that, like other late modernizers, here I include Japan, Germany, and Russia, and later the Soviets, the Chinese elites also discredited traditional religions, which led to a mass rechanneling of religious energies into a very this-worldly singular nationalism and cult of personality, such as the cult of Mao, which also had religious dimensions. So while the cult of Mao in the Communist Party declares themselves atheists, there's this kind of religious energies that were rechanneled, and you have a massification because with the class struggle, you got rid of the traditional gentry class and the landowning gentry class, and then you attacked modern bourgeoisie in the cities, and so you have this leveling, and you create the masses with no sort of classes in between, mediating between the political elites in office, the officialdom, and the masses. And so you have a massification, and then you have this buildup of the cult of Mao with through rechanneling religious energies. And fifth, in the post-Mao religious revival, there is a great pluralization and religious choice now in China. However, the guiding and restraining hand of the state remains strong. So in Charles Taylor's Secularity 3, where you have under conditions of secularity, but you still have people choosing to be religious, to join religious organizations. That's what Charles Taylor calls Secularity 3. You have that too in China today in the post-Mao period, where once again, it's okay to be religious. However, you only have 5 choices to be religious, 5 officially recognized religions. You also have the state religious bureaucracy and administration that is a guiding hand and sets policy and restrains people. And then you also have this interesting phenomenon today where the separation of religion and the state is a bit weak because the state is so involved in guiding and restraining religion. And so you even have some theocratic tendencies. And because, for example, the training of religious personnel and the clerics, like Buddhist monks and Taoist monks, as well as imams for Islam and Christian pastors, they have to go and get their degrees through state-run religious schools and state-funded religious academies. So that's what I mean by some sort of theocratic tendencies. This is very ironic because the state and the party are supposed to be atheistic. Its officials are not allowed to have any religious beliefs or join any religious organizations. So it's a kind of, there's a kind of contradiction built into this process. So that's what I mean by theocratic. For example, the selection of the Panchen Lama for Tibetan Buddhists, that is where the state is very much involved in this kind of so-called magical process where the child, right, you have to go around Tibet and offer different kinds of symbolic sacred objects and see if the child selects the correct object. Here is the state getting involved in this highly religious and non-rational kind of process in selecting a new Panchen Lama. So in essence, basically today you do have a lot of religious freedom. However, the state governs religions. Religions are unable to govern themselves. So that is the situation today. It's a mixed situation. Okay, I think I've probably gone over my time, so I will end there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mayfair. I have a couple of comments and also a question. So you highlighted the current situation that indeed religion can exist. There is a religious pluralism and the 5 religions are recognized. Interestingly, Confucianism is not one of them because Confucianism is considered as part of the Chinese identity as a nation. So what is also very or not familiar from the Western approach is that indeed this tendency of the state not only to control but to interfere into the doctrines of some religion. And here you have the case of the Catholics who are recognized as one of the religion but independently of the Roman Catholic from the Vatican, not because of the doctrine as such, but because this allegiance of Catholics in China to an institution or power outside China is not received well. So as a provocation, I would say that the Chinese state sees itself as a receptacle of transcendence, in the sense that you can be religious in China as long as you do not express loyalties outside the state. And then this brings me to the question of the Muslims in Xinjiang. All Muslims are not persecuted. The horrible situation is about this particular province. You highlighted the history of this province in your talk, but it is also related to the fact that there was a separatist movement in this province. And then in the work I have done on China, the term that comes as an heresy, you can never do that, is splitism. I don't know how you translate this in Chinese, really. I worked with the Chinese team, but I worked on the translation of things. So you are doing a big scene when you want to separate from China as a nation. And that's the same thing with Buddhism and Tibet. So I would compare the situation of the Muslims in Xinjiang today with the condition of Tibet and Buddhism in Tibet. Not all Buddhists are persecuted in China. The ones that follow the Tibetan path. And for Muslim in Xinjiang, it's even more complicated because there is also a classification in China by ethnic. And there was an ongoing debate that started even before communism on, how many ethnies and is Islam an ethnic or religion, and things have shifted around this issue a lot. So there is also this concern about ethnic group not fitting into this vision of China as the main center of allegiance, not only of people, but also of religious traditions. So I stop here because I can go on, and we want also to have question and answers with our audience. But that was also to reposition.
So I would say that, yes, you're correct that the state wants to be above all religions, but it's maybe not, I wouldn't use the word transcendence, because this state is very anti-transcendence. Oh, well, to the extent that it, can support transcendence, it itself is, the highest form, but its ontology, I would say, is very much this worldly. It wants people to pay attention to the material things of life, to material economic development. And that's what this state is all about, sort of nurturing and promoting economic material development. Recently, of course, it started, elements of factions within the state are concerned about spiritual and ethical development too. And so briefly in 2012, there was a Confucius statue that suddenly appeared in Tiananmen Square. And there is a movement to go back to the classics and to integrate more Confucianism. But in the end, I think there's still an ongoing kind of internal question and ambivalence about it really fully incorporating Confucius. So we'll see. And at the same time, even the state has even penetrated and secularized Buddhism. So there are signs, for example, Taiwanese Buddhism is very global. There are several Taiwanese Buddhist organizations that have been, that are somewhat secular and have been doing humanitarian aid across the world, and even have Buddhist converts in Africa. So Tzu Chi Merit Foundation, so on. So these and these organizations from Taiwan have had tremendous influence with Buddhist circles in China. And so in China, I think Buddhism is to a great extent also secularized. And I think that there are certain elements in China that are also thinking of working through Buddhism, sort of in conjunction with the state efforts, as presenting a new face of Chinese culture. So I would expect it's not just going to be Confucianism, but it will also be Buddhism. And it can be quite effective to work that way. That's a kind of a new kind of Buddhist soft power. And offering humanitarian aid, I think the whole world needs that too. People will welcome it. I mean, it hasn't, yeah.
We have lots of comments and questions. I'm going to focus on the questions.
Yeah.
So there is one, there are very interesting comments that I encourage you to read. So the question is about, still China begin to understand Confucianism is too Chinese, and that its Buddhist tradition would perhaps meet better global religious demand and serve global cultural or Chinese global cultural influence. I have another one related to Confucius. Confucius discouraged metaphysical inquiries since ancient China. Do you think that has prevented the possibility of an hegemonic building of Tian as monotheism, as a monotheism? That's a direct question to you.
Oh, monotheism from the worship of heaven? Well, I don't see that because pre-modern China, like many traditional societies, was very much guided by a hierarchical mode of thought. So, you have Tian, that was the highest deity, but you also have so many other deities. You know, you have the sun and the moon. These are, and the various stars and constellations. These are all deified, and you know, different rankings of officials. Maybe the emperor doesn't need to make offerings to such and such a constellation and so forth, but heaven is the monopoly of the emperor. So under these circumstances, it's, you know, it's very different from the monotheistic tradition of the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Yes, that's the question now on Christianity. Apart from the state-endorsed Christianity, there are underground church movements, which the state is also trying to suppress. To what extent is that division between endorsed and underground religious repression reflected outside Christianity in the other faiths, Islam, Buddhism, etc.?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, about 70% of Chinese Christians are underground. And the state is generally, the state is aware of them, and local state officials, depending on particular individual officials and particular local cultures, often turn a blind eye and let them go about their business unless they overstep certain boundaries. So it's a kind of, often it's a kind of peaceful coexistence because local officials know if they act against the underground Christians, it can be more trouble than it's worth. So it's better to just turn a blind eye. And sometimes you also have local officials working with local underground leaders. So it's a very diverse situation in different parts of the country. The other thing is many Chinese scholars of religion urge the government to recognize underground Christians, because if they are hidden underground, they're apt to get into trouble, which means they might start up something more extremist, and then it might be too late if they spread like wildfire. So it's much better counsel the academics to bring them out into the sunlight where, you know, they don't have to hide anything. So this is an ongoing developing situation. Of course, what you had said earlier of them, say the Catholics being loyal to a higher authority outside of the sovereign boundaries of China is a problem for the government. So they have been engaged in talks with the Vatican, right? And the Vatican is also willing to compromise a little and meet with some of Chinese government demands, because the Vatican is concerned that the whole terrain of China is being lost to Protestants, because Protestantism has taken off like crazy, you know? Because the Chinese communists have, in a way, sort of unintended consequences in the suppression of indigenous Chinese religions, of Chinese Buddhism and Chinese Taoism and popular religion. It has actually helped the spread of Protestantism in China. This is also something that some Chinese scholars argue, and which I also support, agree with, that the Chinese Communist Party has actually helped the development of Protestantism, which is taking off like wildfire.
Yeah. A question about the softening of the ultra-secularist specificity of feature you described in your talk. Do you see this softening happening in China, like also it happened in other parts of the of the world. What is your take on that?
Yeah, of course, it's softening now because now people are permitted to worship. You have temples everywhere open and so forth. But it's still not complete opening because there are many constraints, and the state still has the final say over if you want to start up a new temple. The state is the one giving you the permit to allow you to operate, or if you already opened one without permission, at any time the state can decide to shut you down,
Yeah.
even to dismantle the whole building that you spent a lot of money building.
Yeah, I would push back a little on. I think there was a tendency towards softening, I would say, until the early 2000s. But since then, the trend is really tightening up from the state point of view on all religion, including the recognized ones. And I would even add, so of course we mentioned the tragedy of Xinjiang, but there is also, since the COVID-19, even more kind of control on all religious people with the facial recognition, and all the technology that were used to stop the pandemics are also now used to control believers. So there are reasons and room for concerns here about the my take here. I'm not sure that there is a softening of the ultra secularists, to say it differently.
Oh, I meant softening since you know, the post-Mao era, you know.
Oh, okay.
during the
On
post-Mao
this, yes.
Okay, if you're talking about since 2013,
Yeah.
then yes, of course, there's been a tightening in everything, including education, the media, you know, everything. Yes, there's been a tightening. But at the same time, you know, this state also understands its people, and the people are, I would say the people are can be very devious and also very disobedient. So that's, you know, the people just find ways around everything. I mean,
Yeah.
Chinese culture is like, you have a law, you have a rule, and the first impulse is, how do we get around it? How do we bend it? How do we? So it's incredible. It produces incredible intelligence.
Yeah, and
this
innovation,
state, which has so many rules, those rules don't really work very well if you really look at it, because they are so the culture is built around how do we get around the rules.
Yeah. Several questions. One is about the top-down kind of theocratic system you described, and the question is, how is it sustainable, or are there resources in religious tradition that will inevitably push against such control? And
Yes.
the second question from the same person is about the religious groups in Hong Kong, and how far or how much can they remain independent from, you know, the system of the mainland China. So what is your take on that?
Well, so, you know, often Chinese are, this is a civilization with a very acutely developed sense of historical consciousness. So history as a discipline goes way back in Chinese tradition, okay? So history writing and historical consciousness. So I have to go back to the Ming Dynasty, which started in 1368, to talk about so the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty, a guy named Zhu Yuanzhang. He founded the Ming Dynasty. He was a person very much like Mao Zedong. He was a peasant, and he started a peasant rebellion. He joined a millenarian Buddhist sect. And then he was able to topple the Yuan dynasty of the Mongols. And just like Mao Zedong, he was extremely severe against religions. He knew that he toppled the dynasty because through a religious millenarian movement. So he was very paranoid about some other religious movement that would do the same to him. So he came down very hard against all religions, and popular religion included. And he only wanted that kind of Confucian state orthodoxy. But halfway, so he passed many different new laws that were very crushing against religious organizations. But by the middle of the dynasty, everything had eroded away. So he went about very vigorously setting in place all kinds of surveillance mechanisms and so on. But by the middle of the Ming, there's a kind of entropy that took place where all the carefully crafted state surveillance mechanisms and rules and so on just kind of got eaten up. So they used the very system of, Chinese have this baojia system where they arrange families into tens, and then each unit of 10 families are then grouped into 100 families, and they all have the responsibility to inform on each other, or they will all be collectively punished. Okay, so he set in place these things, but then the local energies take the administrative organizations and then they create new religious entities with their gods who are, in charge of this jurisdictional area. So then they repurposed it, the administrative units, and translated into local communities. So I predict that's also going to happen. So the state is very energetic, but the corrosive efforts of ordinary people is also up to the task of corroding and creating entropy.
Another question is about the benefits to those in religious spheres where the intertwining of Buddhism and Confucian beliefs. What does this mix look like? You briefly mentioned the newfound connection of these two practices to gain political power. So could you please provide more insights on that?
Well, I did my field work in Wenzhou, in rural and small town areas of Wenzhou, and then I had to also learn a little bit about late imperial history of this area. So traditionally, you have Confucian gentry who are educated in the Confucian classics, who wanted to pass the imperial examinations to become officials. And so this was at the local level, you have these Confucian gentry. At the same time, they melded with Buddhist monks. They participated in poetry societies with Buddhist monks, and they're all educated, right? And these Confucian gentry would help donation drives for building a new Buddhist temple. So there was a lot of interaction and mutual cooperation. So in China, the boundaries between religions are not like in the West, where you must, if you belong to Methodist church, you cannot go, attend Baptist church services. So, or, Hindu services, right? So in China, it's very porous. The boundaries are very unclear, and there's a lot of crossing over. So you can be a Buddhist and a Confucian and a Taoist at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. So there is a question about the climate crisis, but also the sanitary crisis. And do you see that as a way that can be used to build a sort of new legitimacy for the state and the use of religion? Would you see that?
Oh, climate crisis?
Yes.
Okay, that's a topic that's very dear to my heart because I'm working on editing a volume on religious environmentalism, and I'm also writing a monograph on the same topic of religious efforts to deal with environmental protection and the climate change. So yes, I see that it's not quite there yet. It's starting to develop, but I see long term that religion in China will have a good role to play in promoting environmental protection. So, for example, Buddhism promotes vegetarianism, and there's the notion, doctrine of transmigration, where you can become an animal, right? And all sentient beings, people with, living things with consciousness and feelings, will be reborn and assume a different form in the next life. And so with animals, you want to treat them with compassion, because this animal could be your mother after she has died. She's reborn as an animal. So there's a certain kinship with other sentient beings. There's a feeling of kinship because we are all circulating, after our death, we become new sentient beings. And so they all could be our kin. So there's a lot of possibilities that can play out with religions. And it's also the case that a lot of monasteries, Taoist and Buddhist monasteries, have implemented environmental measures where they're planting a lot more trees in the grounds and surrounding the monasteries. So invoking traditional monasteries, which were often placed in remote mountainous areas near flowing rivers, getting back into nature, having a certain detachment to this worldly material life and the desires and values of material life. So religion also will promote that kind of modest living that is not so invested in consumerism, which is so destructive to the environment. So I think the Chinese government will recognize what religions have to offer for climate change and the environment, and promote them through religion.
So we have a few minutes left. So I would like to combine the last two questions I have here. So would you agree that the position in China is an inverted principle distance that may be in sync with the history of religion in China, and therefore not a blight on freedom of religion as we generally know it today? So, and the last question is, could you talk a little about the relationship between Chinese economic reform since the 80s and the ritual economy during this period? How does the ritual economy complement, adapt, or serve the market economy, as well as contesting and rechanneling it? These are the two last.
Oh, okay. The first one I kind of didn't quite catch, so let me just answer the second one, since that is the main point of my new book called Re-Enchanting Modernity. It's about the ritual economy. So expenditures on religious items such as ritual objects and festivals. These are all, and charities that religious organizations get into. These are religious expenditures that's withdrawing money from the profit economy to put into something that, so local officials in Wenzhou often called religious expenditures wasteful and we're trying to reduce religious expenditures, why do you have to spend so much money on, Buddha's birthday festival, and so forth? And because the Chinese government is so materialist, right? And it wanted people to reinvest their surplus wealth back into growing their industries, which is highly polluting. So religion comes along and says, donate it to support the clerics, donate it for charitable causes, and so forth. So I see the ritual economy as acting as a brake, moderating the excessive profit-driven economy, which creates so much industrial pollution. So, and we need more of a ritual economy. There are also times, of course, where the ritual economy does contribute to the profit economy, so they overlap. So if you're in the business of making incense and making candles and casting bronze deity statues, of course, there's a profit to be made there. And so it can also be a part of profit economy. But overall, it's diverting wealth and resources away from the profit economy and towards community building and redistribution of wealth.
Thank you. In the couple of minutes we have left, this is a question I have. It's that each religious group is concerned by relationship with the state, right? There is this continuous tension or cooperation, it depends. But how would you look at the inter-religious relationship? It seems to me that they do not really exist. Or could you have a take on that? How do religious groups work together or do not work together or coexist independently of the state system that we discussed?
I think that overall, the relations among religions are fairly good. There is rivalry, but the rivalry never gets really out of hand because you have the state being so overwhelmingly powerful that the state is able to adjudicate the rivalries. Okay. And that's a way in which having this strong state has its benefits. Because it keeps down the rivalry. But I have, in my fieldwork, I did notice there was a certain growing, tension, not outright conflict, but tension between Buddhism and Christianity and Protestantism, because these are the two strongest religions.
Yeah, you mean among people? No,
yeah, in terms of adherents, in terms of converts. Oh. They are competing for converts. Yes. And Buddhism is not, because the Protestants are very aggressive proselytizers. And they're robbing the Buddhists of their people. And Buddhists have a tradition of tolerance and, and they're not aggressively proselytizing, so they feel robbed.
Oh, that's an interesting point. So I have gone through the question. If I have not addressed the question, if there was more comment than a question as such. And I would like your name and my own sake, thank you very much, Mayfair, for this stimulating and enriching presentation and shedding light on things that sometimes look a little opaque from a distance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
To all of you, and maybe see you for another other session in the series on religion and nationalism. Goodbye now. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.